Hello, welcome to Language and Power podcast, season 4, episode 3. Today we're talking about just transitions and the way they've been spoken about at COP28. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Michael. Good to be here again.
Yep, good. So one of the themes that has been spoken about at COP28 is the idea of just transitions. We found, actually looking at this, that the information is a little bit patchy on this. So there've been several days where they've been talking about this. We're going to talk about a ministerial event, a high-level ministerial event, which was focused on the idea of just transitions. We've got a press release of that. We've got some other documentation on that we'll look at, and then we're also going to look at some remarks made by US Vice President Kamala Harris and some of the remarks she's made about just transitions. So we'll start off, and just to remind you that all of the links of these we'll put into the chat, not the chat, we'll put all the links of these into the show notes. So we'll start off with a press release given out by the United Nations Climate Change section, and it's entitled "Ensuring No One is Left Behind, First High-Level Ministerial Roundtable on Just Transition." And what we're interested in particularly is that across these documents, Tom, is the definition of just transitions. So we're going to talk about, first of all, the press release from the UN, "Ensuring No One is Left Behind, First High-Level Ministerial Roundtable on Just Transition." And this document, I'll just very briefly read the definition because that's what we're interested in across all of these documents. So there's a quote here by the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary, Simon Steele, and he says this: "The just transition means different things to different people depending on who they are and where they live. But one thing is certain, we cannot and will not leave those with less power and marginalized groups out of the picture. Solutions to the climate crisis are meant to be inclusive. They must ensure that everyone, women, indigenous peoples and youth, in all their diversity, have equal opportunities to benefit from these transitions." So he's giving a definition on that, Tom. How do you think?
No, that's very interesting. As Steele says, it's very hard to find a definition for just transition, and it's a topic that's very close to my heart and one I've spent a lot of time working on. It's interesting that the headline for this press release is "Ensuring No One is Left Behind." That phrase, "no one left behind," which the US has used in education, but also, interesting enough, Rishi Sunak used it in another speech or statement that was issued during COP, which comes in the Downing Street website as on the same day, but as the one we analysed a couple of days ago. But he uses this phrase as well, "no one left behind," and I think it's one of the themes that's developing. But it's interesting when we look at different definitions of different aspects of what just transitions includes in terms of how much you're engaged in the process, how much you're a beneficiary, but how much you're actually active in deciding on the process is very interesting. And I think this is the way that this is phrased here by Steele is very much leaves it open for the superpowers to decide what just transitions means or to set the agenda for transitions. And it's just the idea that less power, those with less power and marginalized groups are not left out the picture. But what does being in the picture actually mean in terms of just transitions? Are we looking at paternalism, where the powerful nations take a paternalistic attitude and tell the less powerful nations what's good for them and how they're going to benefit them? Or does it mean actively engaging with them? It's very interesting then, because if then we turn to another UN document, which was announcing, these events took place over 2 days. On the 2nd of December, we had the big glossy people making statements on just transitions. And on the 3rd of December, there was then the first annual high-level ministerial roundtable on just transitions the following day. But it's interesting, the document on that, we have an objective affirmed that sustainable and just solutions to the climate crisis must be founded on meaningful and effective social dialogue and participation of all stakeholders, and noted that the global transition to low emissions provides opportunities and challenges for sustainable economic development and poverty eradication. The decision also emphasized that just and equitable transition encompasses pathways that include energy, socio-economic, workforce, other dimensions, all of which must be based on nationally defined development priorities and include social protection. So other bits of what a just transition means there, but it's interesting that the first uh, COP document we looked at, the UN COP document, talked about not leaving anyone behind. They must be in the picture. This second definition emphasizes that they actually must be included in the decision-making process, and there
Yeah.
must be full dialogue. So it's this contribution of meaningful dialogue and being the agents or recipients of the processes, the actions needed in order to bring about this change is really interesting dynamics involved in this.
So that's important that in this UN document, you've got a little bit more detail, still not huge detail, but you've got a couple of really interesting actions. So I think, one of the things that's really important about this definition is that it includes social dialogue as a process and participation of all stakeholders as another process. So that's really interesting.
It comes back to an old format for talking about different levels of power and empowerment, which is sort of a buzzword that's gone out of favor, but it was done by Ben Rampton and Fraser and a couple of others. But it talks about, this mixture of having the choice over change and also being the beneficiary of change. So paternalism, the less powerful people have absolutely no say. And there's advocacy where people have choose what they want to do, but other people have to advocate on their behalf. Co-optation, when the more powerful people decide what's going to be done and draw people behind in their wake. And only empowerment is when you are involved both in that decision making and the enactment of it. So it's interesting that you can sort of those 2 points that come up in the documents, how they can be balanced in different ways for different types of real just transitions, is both taking part in the dialogue and being taking part in the actions involved in change as well.
Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder. I mean, maybe I'm just to be skeptical when it says stakeholders. There's a question there of who counts as being a stakeholder.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be. Well, maybe it's a good thing to be skeptical. But if you're giving equal weight to people who do have a lot of power with people who don't necessarily have a lot of power, that's one thing. But the powerful person remains powerful even if you're kind of being put on an equal footing.
Yeah.
I wonder
absolutely.
I wonder if there's something. We I don't know what this process does, but I just a kind of question there about who the stakeholders are. But the other thing about this is that specifically talks about energy, socio-economic, workforce, and other dimensions to be included in this idea of a just transition. And that's not something that we often, sometimes that those other parts of sustainability are left out, aren't they?
I think that's really important here. We see this when a lot of these big speeches from the high power countries are really they're talking about transfer of money and they sort of talk about green energy in different ways, but that whole complexity of what a just transition means in terms of jobs, gender differences, communities is not included in the picture. I think it's interesting that we sort of see different scales of discussion coming on here. It's a big concept in social linguistics, depending on
Mm.
the spatial and the temporal scale you're working on, how discourses change. And at these meetings, it's very much the global economic scale. And so it's about large transfers of money. And from the other side as well, Amir Motley was talking about from the Barbadian point of view, it is asking for money from the global north, developed north as well. And the grassroots stuff is sort of left out at this level of discussion, I think, which is really interesting, which is Sunak actually focused a bit more on it when he talked about local issues and how things would work within the country rather than the global economic scales. There's a lot of interesting connections between or disconnects between this local and global scale sometimes, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think. Well, we'll go on to Sunak. We can come back to that in a little while because we've seen some new documents that he talks about. But I also just wanted to pick up on this. They specifically talk about poverty eradication, which seems to be quite a powerful phrase compared with some of the other slightly more vague phrases that we've seen elsewhere about not leaving people behind, being fair, all of those things are laudable but vague. And I suppose poverty eradication is still vague. You still need to work out how you can do that.
Yeah.
But it is still, kind of quite a focused objective, isn't it? And it's quite radical compared from the things that we often see in Britain.
It is, yeah, and I think it's a term, as you say, it needs unpacking. It can be thrown into things, but then is it discussed in detail what this means, what it would entail beyond, the big gestures, which when we look at Kamala Harris's speech, we'll see is almost entirely big gestures and little detail. But maybe that's what that day is for, politicians standing
Yeah.
up and posturing,
Yes. Yeah. One of the things that we kind of see from this ministerial meeting, we've been able to download slides that were presented at that. And one of the things that they focus on and they refer to specifically are the ILO, the International Labour Organization's framework for just a transition. And specifically, they talk about a document to which we'll put a link in the show notes called Guidelines for a Just Transition Towards Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies for All. And in this document, it's quite a relatively long document, it's 13 pages. And there's, I think you called it a dispersed definition of transition. So we can talk about that. But there are also very explicitly mentions of sustainable economy, about eradication of poverty, again, social inclusion, and so on and so forth. So a little bit more detail, I'd say.
Yeah,
but,
no, I think it's a good document. I think we were laughing because it's a good document because it's properly phrased. There's no soundbite definition of just transition, which is exactly what we were looking for, which is handy for radio programs, but that's not really good research. And so what we see is that there's no soundbite definition here, but interesting, man, coming from the ILO, it's very interesting that this is the official definition referred to, because it does come from a work agenda. It says that on page 4, the 4 pillars of the decent work agenda: social dialogue, social protection, rights at work, and employment are indispensable building blocks, which is a very different focus to some of the stuff we see in the speeches. So really interesting that document's referred to, but does it get picked up on at all with, soundbite politics?
Yeah. One of the things that's striking to me, looking at this ILO document now and thinking back to the documents that we were looking at in our last episode, Sunak and Al Jaber, is that this one provides quite a strong challenge to the arguments that we were looking at there, in the sense that this one is calling for the eradication of poverty. That's a core part of a sustainable and just transition, as they put it, is fully implicated in the idea of a just transition. Whereas what we spoke about, we used the phrase that the 2 politicians we were looking at, we used the phrase riffing on the idea of a just transition. But in Sunak's case, he was using the idea that there are people who are less wealthy in Britain as a reason for not doing the implementing the policies around bringing in heat pumps, for example. Whereas this one is saying, if you get rid of poverty, and if we did do that, presumably, then people would be able to afford some of the more expensive measures. He's kind of attacking that. I don't know. You're looking a bit skeptical on that.
No, I'm not. I'm laughing at the idea there. Laughing wryly at the idea. Maybe my skeptical face and my wry face look alike.
Absolutely.
That's right. And tackling poverty eradication was or leaving no one behind was seen by Al Jaber as, the transfer of wealth from the global north to some extent. And I think it's that point, isn't it, that this is a more complex document. It's a 16-page document with no single definition. It works through, but people can latch onto any aspect of that. Politicians can latch onto one aspect of it, define just transition in a very fragmentary way, and then say, yeah, we're doing that. And we see politicians do that all the time. And I think very much when we look at the Kamala Harris speech, we'll see that she's latched onto one particular aspect of just transition and bigged it up. leaving the rest of the document behind just to turn this on them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's just read a couple more uh, parts of this just to give a bit of
Yep.
background for when we go on. So one of the things in part two, paragraph 3, sharing a common global purpose, there are different approaches, models and tools available to each country in accordance with its national circumstances and priorities to achieve sustainable development in its 3 dimensions, which is our overarching goal. So you've got acknowledgement that circumstances are different in different places, and there are different circumstances at play. So it's just opening that possibility of different models and tools. This isn't trying to dictate what each country should do in a kind of global sense, but it is saying that you do have to have these priorities of sustainable development, which they go on to say, just transition for all towards an environmentally sustainable economy, as described in this document, needs to be well managed and contribute to the goals of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. So you've still got that underlying kind of thrust, whilst acknowledging that there are different ways, there will be different ways of doing that and different specific requirements in different places. So I think that's interesting.
So, yeah, and it's very interesting, and it's sort of in a way that excuses when we see these, headline speeches. This level of complexity, it's impossible to deal with this level
Yeah,
of complexity, or
yeah.
to refer to these different circumstances in these speeches. So, while we can have fun criticizing them and saying how selective they are, of, you just have to wonder what the function of these speeches is in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, isn't it? That is the big question. Why do they do these things? I was thinking about this in terms of the genre. We were talking about whether Sunak's speech was a press release or
Yeah,
not. I think we've since found that he actually gave 2 speeches: a national statement, it turns out, and also a press release speech, which is all very confusing to us. But we've found those. But thinking about the genre, and part of what a genre is defined by is its purpose, or that's one way of thinking about what a genre
yeah,
does. And so what is the purpose of these speeches? So as you say, we know they can't go into this kind of detail. They do want to have sound bites, but what really are they doing by gathering in Dubai in this case
yeah.
and giving these vague, um, very vague speeches, which are very easily criticised by people like us.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's these are the ones we get access to, isn't it? Because the more
Yeah.
sensitive stuff is the stuff that's harder to find. So it is like a big glossy brochure, but a multimodal one with speeches and
Mhm.
everything.
Mm.
I was thinking the same. Are these speeches setting the agenda slowly? Are all the sound bites and all the big phrases that come out? Are these slowly changing the agenda in a
Yeah.
positive way, or are they reactive to
Yeah.
changes that have already happened? It's very hard to know if they are just
Yeah.
reflecting what people want to hear, or they are slowly changing the way we see the environment and all that stuff. And therefore, they might serve an important purpose if they are,
Yeah.
even though they're not very detailed, at least they're bringing things to consciousness.
It's a good question. It's a really good question, because one of the difficulties that we have in then trying to answer that question is that because we've got so few speeches to look at, I know there's many going back, and maybe there's a big research project here
Yeah,
in the offing, but we don't quite, I don't know whether any particular speech is a good speech or compared with the others or not. If it's doing the job of setting the agenda, of setting the mood music, of indicating a direction, of and all the other things that it could do. So if we look at a particular speech, we don't know if it's doing that because it's a good example, or if the particular example we're looking at is just a bad example of somebody doing that, somebody not giving a good speech. Do you know what I mean?
no, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
You'd have
that's
to
the
look
thing
at
to make it into a full discourse research project. You really have to
it.
see the connections and the changes and
Yeah.
relate it to social conditions outside. It's a huge undertaking. It is. I think this is one of the things with discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, isn't it? Is that we can choose individual speeches, whatever, and critique them.
Yeah.
But as isolated text, it's very hard,
Very hard. Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, to say what.
Yeah, unless we know what they're trying to do and what the
Yeah,
typical speech looks like. I remember doing a little blog post about something completely different. It was about energy, but and somebody put in a comment on there. Well, it was about Ed Miliband, a former Labour leader here in the UK. So somebody put in a comment, what he's doing is putting a flag in the ground. Putting a flag
yeah,
in the ground. So a sort of military type metaphor, I guess, sort of
yeah, yeah,
saying,
yeah.
this is where we're standing. And it's up to other people to kind of gather around that and kind of make their contributions, which I think is a fair enough description of that.
I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? So there's putting the flag in the ground. So hopefully you'll change things going forward, or part of that's what a good speech has. A good speech, if we're trying to think what the purpose of these are, would do, but also it would, from the presenter's point of view, show how they've responded to previous calls and how they're doing their bit, which is not only self-justificatory and self-aggrandizement, but also, I suppose, increasing their legitimacy, showing that they've got the authority and the back record to justify putting a flag in the ground for the next stage. So in a
Yeah.
way, if that's how we're looking at them, instead of being totally cynical about them, which we like to do, and which is good fun, uh, if you narrow down their purpose and think about how they might contribute to progressive change going forward, obviously, uh, yeah, there's other things to say about them, isn't there? Than rather than just say that they're light, they're not very detailed, not very complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're propaganda quite often, but propaganda serves a purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, I don't know if this is a good moment to move on to the US vice president. Not to say that what she's saying is claiming that it's propaganda, although I'm sure there's part of that. But we have,
Well,
yeah,
no, sorry, yeah, well, in those terms, yeah, there is, but as I'm thinking of it slightly differently now as I look at it. So this is the speak by Vice President Harris at COP28 leader session, fast tracking, interesting, just equitable and orderly energy transition. That's very interesting because in that uh, Zoom meeting between Al Jabeer and Mary Robinson, amongst others, there was a debate about urgency as opposed to fast tracking, and this level of just how urgent climate change is, or can we do it a pragmatic and orderly approach is again one of the key themes that's coming up. Can we slow it down to a speed that suits our national economies is really sort of what it means. But let's have a quick look through. We've been dogged by technical problems today, dear listeners. Hopefully these will have been edited out, but it means we're a bit short of time. So I'll look through this. It's really interesting. If you look at the speech, Camilla Harris talks about, she starts off the first few paragraphs. What she's really doing is she's setting this very urgent tone about how serious the climate crisis is. So this is one of the things we've been told, we've got to show how urgent it is, so how pressing it is. She talks about communities are choked by drought, washed out by floods, decimated by hurricanes, wildfire smoke darkens our skies. The urgency of this moment is clear. The clock is no longer just ticking, it is banging, and we cannot afford to be incremental. So the opening part, a really strong emphasis on how severe climate change is and the repercussions of climate change, which is very interesting in its own right. And it says, President Biden and I feel a deep sense of responsibility in this moment. So this first phase of the speech, if you like, is very much, if we want to talk in linguistic terms, it's the language of evaluation is all about bad feelings, disaster, danger. But then, so this is the sort of, if talking about argument like we were yesterday, this
Yeah.
is the premise.
Yeah.
But then what's the conclusion? President and I feel a deep sense of responsibility at this moment. We invested roughly $1 trillion over the next 10 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So she changes it around to the solution to this crisis is investment. No, obviously not just investment in particular things. And then she does go on to list some of the things that the US has invested money in, therefore building up and saying it's a responsible donor. We've got this back record. It's a propaganda speech, but it does sort of make the case to carry on doing this. There's a whole list of energy plans within the US and globally that have been invested in, but it doesn't really go much beyond that. It is entirely this. I mean, if we look at that figure of $1 trillion, it says, really noticing the way she says it, it says, we invested $1 trillion years over the next 10 years. So there's a mixture of past and future. And we
Yes.
invested past over the.
Yeah.
So it's still a promise. It's trying to sound like something they've done, but it's still a promise. And bear in mind that these big figures are very impressive. They're very glossy. I keep saying that. Well, actually, the US invests $750 billion every year in the military. So $1 trillion over 10 years in what has been described as this huge existential crisis. These figures that look good, that sound good in the speech, are actually in real terms not huge. So it's very interesting that she's narrowed it down. We're talking about narrowed down to no country left behind, and it, is we're giving lots of money to help other countries develop an energy program so that they can, not suffer the consequences. It's a very restrictive narrowing of what it means. There's nothing about, seriously reducing carbon emissions, how they're going to do it in terms of cutting gases. Now, investing is great in other alternatives, but there's still no mention of reducing carbon emissions from coal and gas, etc., or unabated coal, which is coal that is not a process to remove methane and the like. So it in terms of an argument structure, there's this huge existential crisis. We're going to throw money on it, and human competence will solve it. And this is an argument we hear all the time. If we invest enough in energy, if we invest in alternative technology, we won't need to stop doing a lot of the stuff we're doing.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think that early part, just to go back to this sort of scene setting that you mentioned at the beginning, I think if we also think about the audience, I'm in England, you're in Scotland. We haven't had hurricanes, wildflowers.
We have loads, yeah.
We have got, lots of wildflowers. We haven't had hurricanes and wildfires, and there's a little bit of coastal erosion, of course, but huge floods as we've seen in America. These are things that are very, very, especially last year, a lot of wildfires in the United States.
Yes,
and huge floods and hurricanes. So that's a very immediate kind of and visceral description for people back home for her, having seen these things and making, I get the sense that she's trying to point out to people, these things that you are seeing are caused by climate change. She's not saying it in so many words, but just raising that as a prospect. I think that's interesting in passing, that why would she emphasize that, particularly thinking about the leader? But throwing money at the problem, which I suppose is necessary.
It is, money and human ingenuity, because she then talks about young people and finishes with this. So let us all share in their sense of urgency and their optimism. So we saw the urgency at the beginning where she highlights all the problems. And as you say, instead of denying climate change as past US presidents have done, recognizing it, but then still turning this to optimism, and let us all lead then with ambition and conviction. It moves to this very positive message to say all these bad things are happening. But despite the profound challenges we face and the time that is moving quickly, let us harness that power that we have together to build a cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous future. It ends on this very optimistic note that sort of says, yes, we've got things in hand because we've got good technology, we've got money, and we've got bright young people coming forward, which is great. And one of the things we're going to talk about in a later episode is this mix between optimism and negativity, which is what mix is the most effective for making change. But so it's interesting. I suppose this is the marker in the sand, if you like. The flag is, let's invest heavily in technology and people's ingenuity, and that will solve the problem. Whether that's a good marker in the sand or not is another question.
Yeah. In thinking about the ILO document, and it's specifically talking about inclusion, participation of poor, of everyone, but also eradication of poverty. The equivalent here is having a more prosperous future for this generation. So that, you could say that might include eradication of poverty, but I doubt it. It's not the same kind of discursive take, is it?
No. No, it does talk about making things more affordable, but it doesn't talk about There's not a lot about job employment and replacing the old Rust Belt industries and stuff like that, which it could have done, would have been interesting. But yeah, and in terms of what we're talking about, the transfer, the agency, if the passing on of this money, there's still not a lot of mention of. Okay, so she's met with the Minister Terence Drew from Kitts and St Nevis and Mia Motley from Barbados. So she does try, and she's been in Zambia with spoke to industry. So there's this idea that we've talked to people. It's really sort of reactive talking, but it's very interesting. She says, the whole world will benefit from our work. When the United States increases renewable energy production and innovation, it lowers the costs and boosts the efficiency for everyone. Again, it's very much a paternalistic point of view that the United States will develop this technology, we'll sell it to you, or we'll give you some of the benefits of it. So there's not really a lot of inclusion either in terms of setting the agenda or in terms of taking part in changing the economy, changing the environment. So it's still pretty much we are the standard bearers, we are the flagship, we're doing our bit, but it's very much United States in this prime position, both in terms of discourse and action.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Shall we wrap it up?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a wrap.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I'll just say so. Thank you for listening, and you can find the podcast available to download on the website, where you can also sign up for email alerts when we publish a new episode. We've also have a YouTube channel. Not sure if this episode will make it to YouTube. We'll see. Have a look and you'll find out. And we also have a Patreon page where you can join in with conversation and make comments and so on about each of the episodes. So, see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Thanks, Michael.